To talk about LGBTQI inclusion and development, I'm very happy to welcome Victor Madrigal-Borloz, who is the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Come on, Victor, sorry, it's a little mouthful.
Normally I'm after the very long.
Well, I think your title really explains it all, right? And that people who identify as LGBTQI experience violence and discrimination. You are not the first UN independent expert in this role, but you are one of the first. It is a newer position. Could you talk a bit about why this was created and what that signifies and how the UN sees protecting LGBTQI people, particularly as an integral part of achieving the SDGs?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kate, and to Devex for having me here today. It's a great opportunity to have a conversation. This mandate was created by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in 2016. And it was created as a result of a significant amount of evidence being placed in front of the member states to the effect that people that identify as LGBT or are perceived to be LGBT experience significant levels of violence and discrimination because of that factor. And so the creation of the mandate, which was not easy, it actually fractured the opinion of the member states pretty much in two camps, one that supported vigorously and another that actually suggested that the mandate was being created to promote same-sex marriage or to recruit people into homosexuality, eventually led to the creation of the mandate by the Human Rights Council. And to me, what that signifies is the idea that no analysis of violence, discrimination, and exclusion is complete unless you take into account that particular factor at the base of violence and exclusion. And this has led, I'm the independent expert since 1st of January of 2018, and it has led to a number of academic inquiries of research projects where I've received thousands of inputs from around the world in relation to the way in which this discrimination actually manifests itself, excluding people from sectors that are key to the achievement of sustainable development goals: housing, education, employment, health, political participation, and other realms of life. Eventually, this body of evidence has led me to the conviction that unless violence and discrimination based on SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity, is acknowledged and addressed, we will not be able to know to the extent in which we are being short in complying the SDGs.
So the UN, as you mentioned, even in getting this position established, there's varying laws or cultural views on sexual orientation, gender identity. It can be a hotly political stance to take. And when the UN tries to avoid getting into very hotly political debate. So what is that like for you? And how do you go into countries and try to convince them that this is important given that context?
Well, I think that there's three angles to that conversation. The first one is, this is a hot political issue because criminalization still exists. So as of today, 67 countries still criminalize homosexuality or some sort of same-sex intimacy. 10 of them have the death penalty in the books and 5 implemented regularly. That means that as of today, 1 of every 4 persons in the planet is living in environments that criminalize sexual orientation and gender identity or some forms thereof. Clearly, this is not an easy issue to untangle, particularly because a lot of these laws are the result of colonial processes that allowed the entrenchment of structures of power in colonial states, and dismantling that structure actually takes a significant political leadership that we are not seeing in many of these countries. Secondly, LGBT issues are easily politicized. They are used to galvanize political bases in a way that it's very effective and that yields significant political profit. In my lifetime, I have stopped counting the number of political campaigns that are waged on same-sex marriage in countries where hunger and conflict are significant concerns, and yet the whole political campaign is waged on same-sex marriage. Today, we see the same politicization in relation to gender identity and the very existence of trans women, where we know that it's a major part of the political narrative in many countries on the global West, although that we know that it's a relatively marginal issue in social terms.
Yeah, and yesterday we had our UHC pavilion. We actually had a discussion on monkeypox and how its association as being more prevalent in men who have sex with men. Obviously, with AIDS, we saw that too, and in a context where it is criminal too, it really shuts people out of getting treatment and healthcare. And next year we have another high-level meeting on UHC. What would you like to see be on the agenda in recognizing this, and what do you hope to come out of that as it relates to supporting LGBTQI rights?
Absolutely. Well, I think the point is, in environments of negation, where there is the idea that just erasing that factor, it's absolutely impossible to get worthwhile data to produce good public policy in relation to health. You've given the example of monkeypox. The most recent statistics speak of 98% of cases being in the population of men that have sex with men. Clearly, this is not going to be an easy disclosure to do in environments that criminalize, because this is tantamount to self-incrimination in many cases. We saw that with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where some of these issues were circumvented by exactly the use of identities that are not political in nature. But still, I think the stigma remains there. And it basically brings us to the conviction that data has no integrity. Because how do you ask people about their housing situation where you cannot ask them who they live with, given that this is, again, criminalized? How do you ask about sexual behavior when this is criminalized? And there you see the whole aspect. I think that the ideal of good public policy requires that this not be erased as a factor in the understanding of the well-being of the population. The Human Rights Council, my mandate, we're working very hard on placing evidence before states about the enormous consequences that this produces in populations and communities, in which case, just to give an example, the life expectancy of a trans woman in Latin America is of 35 years of age. Let that sink in for a second. A woman of 25 years, a trans woman in Latin America, is entering her old age. That is extraordinary, and it is part of the fundamental responsibility of leaving no one behind.
And speaking of data, you are about to give a report, I think, next month to the GA on how LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted in conflict. Seeing a lot of conflict around the world. We're following this session, we'll be talking about the conflict in Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that report will say and how you are going to use that data to drive home the point of how important this is?
Well, the inquiry was based on testimonies that I've received around the globe by people affected by conflict, which led me to the working theory that eventually was verified, in the sense that there is a weaponization of sexual orientation and gender identity during armed conflict. That the perceived vulnerabilities of lesbian women or gay men, bisexual persons, trans persons are utilized by the parties in conflict to actually effect certain forms of violence that are effective in the sense of silencing populations and communities, for example, particularly populations and communities that have strong networks of dissent because they have built them over their resilience out of realities such as being cast away from your biological family. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is the invisible yet particular and differentiated impact of armed conflict in LGBT populations, which we see in cases, for example, in Ukraine, where trans women were not able to leave the country because their documents still represent them and misgender them as males, and therefore they were not able to leave the country, or the fact that LGBT people are systematically excluded from shelters resulting in a situation where in Ukraine there are only 16 beds available for LGBT people that are forcibly displaced at the moment. And that gives you an idea of the way in which armed conflict and violence by prejudice affects in a way that it's not yet very well researched and where the evidence base is not yet available to create also preparedness in these fields.
So many people in the audience today represent NGOs, civil society, other international organizations, private sector. What do you think they should do to incorporate this more into their work? It impacts pretty much any program that somebody's probably working on. This impacts it. So what advice would you give to them?
Well, I have crafted my guidelines for inclusion in relation to SDG were crafted during the COVID-19 response and recovery. And then I elevated them to guidelines in relation to SDG furtherance. And they are the ASPIRE guidelines. And ASPIRE is an acronym that reflects 6 words that, in my view, are the key. Acknowledge the existence of LGBT persons, and that is at the political level in states, but also within structures. Support LGBT-led and LGBT-serving organizations. Protect LGBT persons from violence and discrimination, adopt intersectional approaches. Nobody defines themselves just as being gay or lesbian. We all come to our realities of privilege or discrimination with a certain socioeconomic status, a certain race, a certain migratory status, and that needs to be acknowledged. Representation is key. We see a lot of integration of urban gay white males to C-suites, but that is not extending to lesbian women, and that is not extended to trans and gender diverse persons. So how do we extend that inclusion to include different populations? And finally, evidence-based approaches. Everything in this field will go wrong if we continue, and governments, private entities, and organizations continue operating on the basis of prejudice rather than cold hard evidence.
All right. Well, thank you. That is a great note to end on, Victor. Appreciate it. Encourage you all to look that up. ASPIRE. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you very much.